mai te pakipaki kia Jane and Mark. Kia ora.
Thank you so much. And so Mark and I are probably changing gears slightly and introducing a different topic, which is about suicide in the media. But before I do that, I would just like to say that last week I go to a lot of suicide I'm so appreciative of I feel like I've learned a lot and also appreciative of the journey that people So, media reporting of suicide. I've done a bit of work in this area. When people talk about media reporting of suicide, and I'm sorry I might be telling you some things you know, hopefully a few things you don't know, but people often talk about the Werther effect. And by that they mean the phenomenon where when suicides are reported, when the Sorrows of Young Werther, Goethe's novel, was published in the 1700s, there was this spike in suicide seen. The novel was banned, so that's where the phenomenon gets its name from. One of the things that is important to say about the Werther effect is that it's not just suicides that might have happened anyway being brought forward. There's not a commensurate drop.
Can I give you this?
Oh, sorry.
Just to clip onto your name label.
Oh, okay. I've been given a fluffy thing to clip on. I don't even know what that is.
Just recording.
Did I? Oh, sorry. It looks slightly like
Or onto your shirt if you want.
Sorry. I feel like I'm attaching some sort of animal to myself. Sorry.
Good. We'll just go onto your...
Thanks. I need a bit of tidying up. So that's the Werther effect. More recently, and when I say recently, in the last 10 years, people have started talking about the Papageno effect, which is kind of the reverse. So that happens when stories of hope and recovery from a suicidal crisis are published in the media or reported in the media, and there is then sometimes seen a drop in suicides. So they're kind of like a twin pair. The other thing just to say about the Werther effect is that there are certain types of stories that are more likely to result in the Werther effect, and they're stories that are prominent, that are sensationalist, that are really explicit about suicide, and particularly explicit about suicide methods, and also stories that involve celebrity suicides. So the response to that by the suicide prevention community around the world has been guidelines to help journalists and other media professionals report responsibly on suicide. So here you can see our Australian guidelines, the one on the left, which are called Mindframe. They've been around for a long time now. And the New Zealand guidelines, which are briefer, I'm less familiar with them, but they're briefer and have not been around for so long. But at the bottom you'll see there are multiple others. Many countries around the world have created guidelines to encourage responsible reporting of suicide, and in fact Iasp and the World Health Organization also have guidelines that often get used in countries where there aren't within-country guidelines. So the content of Mindframe and most of the other guidelines is pretty similar, and you'll see when I put the detail of this slide up that they respond to some of the things I just mentioned about the types of stories that might increase the risk of suicide following the story being reported. So for a start, the Mindframe guidelines suggest that journalists might want to think about whether actually that suicide should be reported on or not. If it is one to be reported on, I should say the guidelines aren't about censorship. So there's a recognition that sometimes it is appropriate to report on a suicide, that there are benefits to educating the public about suicide and its prevention. So they're definitely not about censorship, but they're about making sure that if a suicide is reported on, it's done well. So reducing the prominence of the story, modifying or removing information that might increase risk. So sometimes that's being perhaps a little bit vague about the details of the death. Taking care when interviewing people with lived experience, and in particular, taking care when interviewing people who've been immediately bereaved by the suicide that's being reported on. Partly just as a common courtesy, you know, as a respectful thing, but also because people who've been bereaved by suicide can be at heightened risk themselves. Applying specific cultural considerations. So in the case of the Mindframe guidelines, a lot of that's about taking care with reporting suicides by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have particular cultural views around naming someone who's died or presenting images of someone who's died, placing the story in context and making sure that it's accurate and balanced, so not inflammatory and sensationalist, taking care, as I said, when reporting celebrity suicide, minimising the details about the method and the location, and again that's because reporting the method in explicit detail has been shown to lead to spikes in suicides by that method. Oh, sorry, I've said that one. Considering the language that gets used. So, for example, people rail against the phrase commit suicide because it can increase the stigma around suicide because commit is associated with crime and sin. And importantly, promoting help seeking. Also, the Mindframe guidelines, and this isn't the case with all guidelines, suggests that journalists should look after themselves. You know, they recognise the impact that reporting a story on suicide can have on the journalist. So that's the kind of content of the guidelines. The process of the Mindframe guidelines was that they were first prepared in 2002. They weren't called Mindframe at that stage. And at that time, there were very few precedents around the world. They've been regularly updated and always with input from journalists and editors. So they've been led by what's now known as the Hunter Institute of Mental Health in Newcastle. But it hasn't just been the Hunter Institute folk who've done it. They've worked really closely with journalists and editors along the way. They've run training sessions and briefings, so they haven't just created these guidelines and expected them to have an impact. They've worked really hard to embed them. In particular, they've got the guidelines into every single school of journalism. So they're in the curricula of every single school of journalism in the country. So no new journalist coming out of tertiary education now would not be familiar with our Mindframe guidelines and the reasons for responsible reporting. They've also enshrined them in statements of ethical conduct of professional bodies, like journalism professional bodies, and also in the guidelines of individual media outlets. So that's been important too. And evaluation, including some that we've done, but also some that's been internally done by the Hunter Institute of Mental Health, has shown that media reporting's improved significantly since the Mindframe guidelines were released. And this is a graph from some of the evaluation work we did. So you can see in the dark blue, so what we did was look at media reports of suicide pre and post the release of the Mindframe guidelines originally. So we had reporting from 2000, 2001, and then reporting from 2006, 2007 in the dark blue and the light blue respectively. Those the 9 sets of bars relate to the specific types of recommendation in the guidelines below. And without going into detail about it, you can see that almost exclusively, not quite exclusively, the light blue bars are lower. So a smaller percentage of media items were doing things like including inappropriate language after the release of the guidelines. So that was good news. You know, they seem to be making a difference. Around the world, there have been evaluations, not millions, I have to say, but some evaluations of similar guidelines. And I've chosen these two examples because they've not only looked at whether media reporting has improved, but also whether there's been any impact on suicide. So the first study is probably the most famous study in the field. There was a problem in Vienna with reporting of suicides on the Viennese subway system. So there were guidelines that were quite specific, actually, that were about reporting of suicide in that context. So not only was that followed by an improvement in the reporting of those suicides, and in fact it was a reduction. There was a lesser likelihood that they would be reported, but there was also a significant decrease in subway suicides and also a decrease in overall suicides. So that was great news. And similarly, this second study in Hong Kong, similar results really, except that they'd been concerned about student suicide. So there was improvement in reporting of student suicides and a reduction in student suicides following those guidelines. This is, you'd be familiar with Robin Williams, a well-known celebrity who took his own life in 2014. We and others around the world looked at whether the reporting of Robin Williams' suicide adhered to guidelines and whether this had any impact on suicide. So some work, by the time we did this work in Australia, some work had already been done in the US and in Canada. We were interested in whether the Australian reporting of Robin Williams' suicide adhered to the recommendations in the Mindframe guidelines and whether there was an increase in suicides in Australia following that reporting. So I haven't got much time, so what I might do is flick through the slides and go straight to what we found and then just kind of tell you a little bit about how we found it. So what we found was that although the Australian media did adhere really well to the Mindframe guidelines, which was great, unfortunately there still was an increase in suicides following in the 5 weeks after Robin Williams' own suicide. It was actually an 11% increase, so it was quite a substantial, significant increase. And it was also an increase by middle-aged men, so men in a similar age group to Robin Williams, who used the same method that Robin Williams had used. So, so we wondered why that was the case, you know, all this great reporting. And we certainly weren't wanting to say, well, you want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, good reporting makes no difference, because I really don't think that's the case. I think good reporting is important. But we did wonder whether it was kind of bigger than that and whether there were unhelpful overarching narratives. And when we looked at the media items, they were all about a tragic clown takes his own life kind of thing. They weren't narratives about how reaching out for help might be a really good thing to do. So we wondered about the narratives. We wondered whether there's more sort of drilling down that needs to happen. And we also wondered whether there are other reasons that just relate to the world we live in, where people get their news from all over the place. So obviously people weren't only getting their news in Australia about Robin Williams' suicide from the Australian media. And we did know from these other studies that other countries, and particularly the US, had terrible reporting. So it was probably not, in some ways it wasn't a fair question. It's not that it wasn't a fair question, but it would have been unfair to expect the Australian media to have totally solved the problem. Anyway, so that was what we found. So to conclude, I would say that media guidelines on reporting of suicide definitely constitute international best practice. They're really important, but we might want to consider whether we need to go a bit further with them. So are there certain recommendations that should be further reinforced? And is it the case that more nuanced information on how to frame stories, so some of that stuff around narratives, should be provided? So I might leave you with those thoughts and hand you over to Mark, because I know Mark's going to pick up on some of this. I'll just get this rodent off my thing.
Kia ora, Jane. Thank you so much. E te whānau, we have just had a slight change to our agenda because we're flexi around here and we just go with the flow. And so we do want to acknowledge that Mark was about to give us a kōrero. We're actually going to invite Mark to come back because we're going to have a short break just to get some beautiful air outside for 5 minutes. But before we do that, Again, we want to invite Mata Tawaire up here and acknowledge Jane for being a part of us today, sharing on knowledge with us.
Reporting, just a complete and utter legend. I met her online 2 weeks ago and I was just sort of stunned. I felt like one of my teenage daughters who would just be rendered mute, because this woman I've followed, so much of the work we do is based off her incredible study and work. She's so modest about it. But anyway, it was a delight to meet her in person. And I'm going to kind of very much watch the beautiful groundwork that she set and put the New Zealand context to it, remembering it's me, but I'm so ably supported by Tanya and Sarah and others. God, I've just named people and then omitted some, so there'll be people offended, but I can pick up a phone to those two and I know that we're going to kind of come up with some solution, or we're going to be able to pull people in. So they've got this amazing structure in Australia that we're working toward. So without further ado, this is slightly following on from what Jane said. So basically, interacting with media on responsible reporting is one of the 4 key evidence-based strategies for preventing suicide, which is why we have guidelines. And I helped in the update of the WHO guidelines last year, which was a complete and utter honour to do that as well from a Aotearoa perspective. So these are really important things. We updated our own guidelines in 2021 to encourage responsible reporting, and they are literally a page and a half, essentially do's and don'ts, and there's a bit of stuff around that as well, which is good and sometimes not so good. But there you go, that's just the way of the world. And when you're working with media who are fast-paced, just there's an urgency about everything, they could be really good, but we haven't got them embedded into journalism training schools yet. But a lot of what I do is actually go into journalism training schools and talk to the young pups and kind of hopefully embed that to them, in them. With the Papageno effect we talked about, and also what I'm really liking, what I'm hearing a lot more is about the overarching narrative of a story. Hope, recovery and mastery of crisis are becoming the new pointy edge of things. You know, we often fixate about particular words and phrases, but actually we've got to look at stories within the context, which is really hard to sometimes explain to a jobbing journalist who is furiously wanting to write a story about what they perceive as might be a cluster within... Is that you, Virginia? You're sabotaging... My colleague is sabotaging my... So I'm going to, I'll dive into that a little bit more. I've got a 7-slide presentation, but it's probably about 20 slides worth of information. I did everything that you're not meant to do in a presentation, which is cram a ton of content, so bear with me. Oh yes, this is always the one that is problematic. I know media, I know a lot of journalists really well, and I know them and I respect them as individuals and what they have to do. But man, oh man, it can be a real tough thing. And they kind of know the guidelines exist and they go, yeah, I know all about it, but they can really hate any editorial input because that's what they hear. We live in New Zealand, they have a freedom to write about what they want. So my job and our job is to educate them about stories regarding suicide, which could have catastrophic consequences on certain communities. And I'll talk about a couple of examples. But I'm a bit loath to say censorship, but sometimes they do raise the C word. As I said, our New Zealand guidelines, I meant to bring them up here, but they literally are 2 pages. And then there's a supportive commentary with a lot more of the why they have to do these. They're very much do's and don'ts about specific suicides and the importance of shifting the focus onto coping, hope and recovery rather than the act of suicide. Obviously, we've got the guidelines and then there's the Section 71 of the Coroner's Act, which says they can't name the method or the location of the method or call it a suicide until a coroner has determined that, which is where sometimes breaches come into being. But equally, sometimes they will mention a euphemistic term for a method because a coroner has stated that within a coronial finding. So there's a few complicated things that swirl around. Also within the guidelines, they mention this very real risk of contagion, particularly when you're talking about celebrity suicides and also around youth suicide reporting. And, you know, media are asked to be aware of the impact on bereaved whānau. Somewhat ironically, a lot of them are creating stories because bereaved whānau are reaching out to media. So there's this real tension sometimes because they'll get all the stacks of reports from a service provider, and they'll have all this information and they'll be asking me about the stuff that I don't know about any individual cases, so it can be a bit problematic sometimes. Very much around the need to include a context for telling a story and including those coping strategies. The thing that worries me the most about reporting here is with significant overseas suicides, and also how often they you know, let's just name them. New Zealand Herald and Stuff will include international copy on their websites, and with a minimal kind of editorial glance, because there would have been some young 20-something sitting at a desk somewhere and just going, oh, this looks like a good story, and they shove it on their website without really knowing and understanding because the Daily Mail just has the most gruesome, awful detail so often, which is why they want to put these stories out. Also, remembering that these media guidelines are relevant to all broadcast platforms. They feel a little bit binary because they're very much around, you know, sort of traditional media, and journalists and everyone who's writing a story about suicide is going to be trained and they're going to know how to ask the right questions and get the right sources, but nah, when you're talking about social media. Also there's covers public commentary, and something we've created MHF, I know you can't read this, but it's just a little two-pager about talking about or reporting on suicide and mental health, so it can be really useful. It was developed for politicians because they're hideous offenders at saying the wrong thing. So, and prior to the election, we sent them to all candidates ahead of them talking about anything to do with mental health, but this is super relevant to everyone else. So, finally, I'm getting on to what I do, which is monitor 2,000 stories about suicide every year, or more than 2,000, but I couldn't be bothered giving you the exact number. There's about 58 media outlets I engaged with, and within that, there's many journalists and reporters who are ringing me, and a lot of what I do is asking for changes to story content that obviously may breach the guidelines or Section 71 of the Coroner's Act, and that's where I rely a lot on many of the SPCs here today who I've got to know through saying, hey, there's a story here in our local paper which is really off. And invariably I would have probably got to it, or I've seen it and I might have actually dealt with it, but it's so good to have that extra local support. And I'm probably jumping a point, but anyway, that's useful to me to know, and for you to also go to those media outlets. Having worked in a newsroom, they get really, really annoyed, which is great, when people complain. And when people complain, they sort of go, oh, we're doing something not quite right. And so the more that complain about how they talk about a story, you might get a change to happen, or better still, they might think about it next time they're reporting on a story to change how they do things. So I'm spending a lot of time just, you know, sorry, you've done this, this, and this, which I think is breaching the guidelines. Then generally within 30 minutes, I will get an email back from, you know, an editor, these really busy editors who take the time to actually telling me why I'm wrong, and why they're journalists who knows everything there is to know about the suicide media guidelines, why they're right and why I'm wrong. But the fact is they 99.9% of the time respond to me, shows that it's having some sort of an impact on them. Occasionally I get a win, and they will make amendments. I spend a lot of time supporting media when they're writing stories. You know, I might help them find a suicide prevention expert within the local community, wherever they're from, or directing them to the correct statistics. You know, so often they've just calling me saying, oh, I've heard from my sister-in-law's brother's aunt who's an Uber driver that this has happened in the community, and so you have to take them back to, you need to ring the coroner's office and da-da-da-da-da. And so there's a bit of education to be done there. I spend quite a bit of time discouraging media not to publish a story, and that happens quite often. Like pre-Christmas, I was actually on holiday, it was the 21st of December, and I had a reporter from Northland saying, there's been 4 suicides, I want to write a story about it. I didn't know anything about whether they were right or not, or correct in their numbers, but I said, why would you want to do a story like that pre-Christmas when you are probably going to be publishing on the 23rd or the 24th of December, and what about services for that community? And you need to verify what's happened in your community. So they didn't publish then. I know they got back in touch, and then I quickly ring the coroner's office and go, what's happening, and SPO. So we kind of begin the process of making sure that if the person rings back, I've got more information, I can steer them again away from doing that. And so far, there hasn't been a story yet. But again, a lot of story ideas for journalists come from local community Facebook groups, and this was a classic example of a lot of uncontrolled, just Wild West information happening on Facebook groups. So another stream of getting into the moderators of those groups. Sometimes you have a bit of luck there, sometimes not. We send out not-for-publication media advisories, and these are for stories with the potential for significant community impact. And for instance, Olivia Podmore was a classic case of that. It was just like, we need to calm the farm. This is just getting out of control. Her relationship, she was the cyclist, had missed out on the Olympic team, and there was some social media involved just before she died. She knew a lot of the media, they took it all so personally, and so often with media they want to find someone to blame or an organisation to blame, you know, the poor management of Cycling New Zealand, whatever it was, and there was this kicked off in a way that was pretty full on. And so we sent this very detailed, don't report any further because of XYZ, and come to me if you are going to do a story. So as a result of that, I had lots of media contacting me saying, hey, here's the script for our intro for the news bulletin tonight. Does this read okay? So again, and so much feedback from journalists saying, oh my God, that's so good. I'm really, it's really helpful to me, because they were all getting caught up in the emotion of this. And which is a mental note to self, when there is going to be a inquest finding that will potentially blow up again. But again, we can work with the coroner's office around how much information they can share, or there could be a media, there's an official legal term where they can actually stop media reporting, which is really helpful. A media block, let's call it that. Most of my work is in relationship building. It's better to be in their camp. Sometimes I'll get yelled at and I'll just have the phone out there and I'll be tutoring away, looking at some nice cats on TikTok or something, and just let them get it out of their system. But it's, you know, it's acknowledging that they're all learning that. We're experts here, they're not, and but they think they are, and they think they've got the answer to, you know, everything. So there's a lot of work there. I also visit journalism schools. It's nowhere near as embedded in the way that Australia is, but they're way further advanced, and they've got all this brilliant resource to do that, but I still do that. So, and it's amazing talking to young people who are really, they're way more personally impacted by knowing somebody who's died by suicide, and so they've got a real kind of willingness, and they're way more open to, once journalists get old and gnarly, and it's almost a lost cause, but there you go. And recently we've done a lot of work with script writers for TV and movie scripts, and I had this one just before Christmas of these young lads who had got funding from New Zealand On Air to write this very much a New Zealand-based script in a small New Zealand town, and the very first episode there was this hectic scenes of young people drinking and throwing up and blah, and then they were going to describe an actual suicide. They had the method, location, they had everything. It was just like, this is out of control. So we're able to pull that back, and they've redeveloped that first episode. So that's, you know, tick, a nice win there. So it's about that relationship, and we have that with Shortland Street, though recidivist offenders often, because they'll have these elaborate storylines that suddenly you hear about it and it's too late because it's, you know, it's there. But we try to work with them to, hey, have you got any storylines coming up? How can we help, you know? And we've been working with a lot of government agencies to reduce risk of contagion, trying to insert interventions, particularly when there's new and novel methods, and with the likes of, you know, how do we get help-seeking information inserted into TikTok when all these people with these hideous algorithms coming at them, and they have often no control over the content they get. So it's been, I think we've had some success in doing that, and again, it's a multi-pronged attack. And the great thing about New Zealand is we can send out a Teams thing to lots of people, and ping, people will be there within half an hour, and we can kind of work out who's the relevant agency, how can we work together to, you know, bring some calmness to it. As I said, we've adapted guidelines for politicians and media, and I think with all of this, it's about explaining why media need to report in a safe way, and that was what Jane did so beautifully before me. We know the risk, but media often don't. So I've got 2 slides to go. So the work still to do, ongoing issues, is educating media. I think I'll be educating media until I'm an old man, but that's okay. You know, that whole thing about mastery of crisis, hope and recovery, and so many of our stories about a suicide death relate to poor service. So, and it's really hard to kind of, they love those sort of stories, you know, yet again another service has failed to deliver, and you've got a tragic story that they turn into something a bit more. Also, many of the journalists who are writing these stories might be crime journalists, so they're used to being in a courtroom, hearing graphic content there, and they know that the sexy, sassy headline is drawing listeners in, or sorry, readers in, so lots of challenges then. What's the challenge is why media continue to publish stories on suicide. I went to the Iasp conference. Finally, I was let out of Mount Eden, and I went to Paran, and I was sitting in a lecture theatre, and there was this woman from Headline in Ireland who did this short little presentation about the coronial reporting on, actually it was Caroline Flack's inquest. And I went, oh my God, I can adapt that to a New Zealand situation. So it's a little bit lo-fi compared to their one, but where last year there were 30, I don't know why I did that, there was 30 stories about coronial reports published. So they were unique stories, and then of those 30, they were republished everywhere else. So we're just crunching some data at the moment about, you know, were any of the guidelines breached? What was the tone of headlines? And so many of those stories are around the poor service that many people, either within mental health services or within prisons and equivalent, receive. So and journalists go, well, they're gifted a coroner's ruling. Some of them come with a press release, and we had an issue a few weeks ago where this person had died in prison in 2014, I believe, and they'd used the same method that they'd attempted with earlier, and the coroner had thought it was good to include the term a common personal item. So you could interpret what that was, but they had sent this release with the coroner's report. So media were gifted that. So it's hard, I mean, so there's a bit of education to go with, do I say that? With the coronial service as well, and about those sort of things. Oh, here we go. New media, social media, normalising suicidal behaviours. As I suggested, their algorithms, are forcing this content on users, which clearly leads to trauma and distress. And particularly if it's in a community and you've got young people, it feels overwhelming. I say we, but within agencies, there's a bit of a connection with some social media providers. Some are better than others. But sometimes the content in and of itself doesn't breach their guidelines, but it's the sheer quantity that is coming in for people. So there's that. Can you let me know how much longer I've got? So anyway, that's something. So I think what the work to do is bringing together multiple agencies at critical times, and we've seen that, and it works really well. And I know Sarah has done that really well out of SPO. There's the rise of these pro-suicide sites, again, providing easy access to novel methods and what have you. We were able to get some of the internet service providers are really ick about this, the idea of them becoming the censor about content. But I think when you're talking about these kind of like sanctioned suicide websites, it's pretty clear that this is a high risk to many, many people, and that they could stop it by just blocking that from happening. So I think that was a good example, because sanctioned suicide just laughed in the face of a Department of Internal Affairs cease and desist letter. So it's using whatever we can and whoever we can to kind of try and protect vulnerable people. I think an issue too, the reliance by media on influencers as experts, which is, there's a couple of people that are the go-to spokespeople on the suicide crisis or whatever, and it can lead to simplification of a very complex topic. And this is when I rain on many journalists' parade, because they want to do this story and they believe that it's in the public interest that they know that sanctioned suicide exists. What about these parents who don't know that? And it's like, so it's about having to talk to them about a huge amount of harm that can be done by naming things. We know that the flip side to all of this is that we publish about suicide. It has both the risk of contagion, but also a big part is suicide prevention as well, as we've seen with Papageno. So I try to steer away media from trying to find blame and that sensational crime style of reporting. What you can do, let me know, because this is me fighting against thousands of journalists, he says, but I've ably assisted, absolutely, but it does feel a bit daunting sometimes. I can absolutely go to media and ask for alteration, and they tend to acknowledge that, as I said. It's one of those risky things sometimes. If you go to them too often, it becomes white noise. But alert me to any stories developing in your region. It's helpful to be aware before media call me about something, and sometimes I can ring them and say, hey, I hear you're doing a story, and that always freaks them out, because they kind of, how do you find out what's going on? And I don't mind that, because it's quite good. And contact the media outlet directly. Monitoring community social media pages is hugely important, because how young people consume media, they're not opening a newspaper anywhere. And this is so often where many of the stories just are spawned, and it's you can alert moderators of those pages about any concerning content that is generally, if they're moderated, they should be respectful of making change. And also you can let the social media platform know, and I know that makes you probably feel just like, oh, but actually, if you go to this, feedback at tiktok.com, it might happen. There's NetSafe can help you as well. I can do that too. So more of us do it. They might make change. It's just that sometimes the change doesn't come quite quickly enough. Because you're talking about a major issue blowing up. Here's a controversial one. Make yourself available to media. The more suicide prevention experts willing to engage with media will help counter the negative narrative. Hopefully it'll encourage balanced reporting. It's the bane of my life, actually, because they'll say, well, who can I talk to if you're not letting me talk to, Joe Blogs? And then I'm like, oh, yeah. I could share this with you later, but these are some of the things that every time I send any email to any media outlet, they always get the suicide media guidelines. The WHO guidelines that were updated September last year. ChatSafe is brilliant, out of Australia again, but I think we're heading toward a Aotearoa version. That's very social media focused, but useful because I've got lots of their contact addresses for all the different platforms that you Mindframe. I use the guidelines for stage and screen to help people who are doing a film. You can complain to BSA and the Media Council, and we've also complained to the advertising standards previously. But generally, go to the media outlet first, come to me, and then if we're not getting anywhere, we can go to that. And sometimes we can wield a really big stick with the coroner's office and the suicide prevention office as well. And here endeth the lesson. That is me. Done. So thank you very much for listening.
Kia ora, Mark. I am aware that we may have time for one or two burning questions. If there is anybody in the room that may have a question for Mark at this time. Kia ora.
I'm just asking, do you as an advisor, do you get opportunities to go into at government level to the education places that teach new journalists?
Yes, that's what I say. I go into schools, but they don't have to say yes to me. So they might go, oh yeah, we've got space. And now I've gone into a few. They set aside this in May. You're going to go and you're going to have 2 hours with the students, and you go into a hot stuffy class like this and just talk for 2 hours.
About the actual program that are taught by.
Oh.
Do you have a say input?
No, I don't. No. I'm sort of looking up at Sarah. If it's a tricky question, I look to Sarah. I guess my role is to let people be aware that the media guidelines exist and how to use them and apply them. That's. So yeah, it would absolutely be brilliant if that was part of their learning. But most of them will have at least one class where they would be talking about ethics. It usually falls into the ethics part of reporting.
Kia ora. One more question from the floor? Kia ora, Ben.
Kia ora, Ben.
I'm in awe about how much you must actually do, because
Oh.
there's lots that come at you, and also the stuff that, so I'm thinking, in terms of my own social media algorithm,
Yeah.
I tend to get a lot of fitness industries affected by or impacted by suicide in some ways, and then there's some sort of CrossFit-y, marathon running, fundraising situation in which the awareness campaign sort of steps into some weird blurred line of languaging and and they're doing a good thing. And how many people are kind of you should know, but is that the type of stuff that you also do?
Where do you begin and stop? If you see something that is really, really dangerous, I mean, because sometimes people say the wrong thing, they are well-meaning, but when it becomes dangerous, when it becomes somebody talking about they want to be with somebody who's just died by suicide and all that sort of awful stuff, that's when there needs to be a multi-pronged approach, because that's huge. And myself, I can't really do that. But yeah, those sort of little things that you go, oh, that's not quite, I get what they're trying to achieve. You know, you either get, you know, you can slide into their DMs and sort of say, hey, let's not talk about committing suicide. Let's just say, you know, let's turn it into a well-being thing. And I think earlier we talked about all those, you know, social determinant kind of things that can really uplift people's well-being, rather than, you know, we have a real focus. I don't know whether it's here in Aotearoa, but it's about suicide, you know, rather than let's look at what can make, you know, because we can use social media for good, and doing those really, I should follow some of the stuff you do, because I need some inspiration on the old exercise front. Oh,
And our last whāpai from Linda.
I was hoping I'd get away without a Linda question.
Lovely work, you know that. I have a question that I'm picking up on from Kai down here, Southway as well. So I know you go into the schools, and I know you do with journalists about to be journalists.
Yeah.
And is there any appetite around how we can get you in front of the people that make decisions about the programming and the planning?
Yes, and I know exactly what you mean, and it's like, yes, that it must be. I think it would probably help having a letterhead that might be some really grand, you know, because I love the idea of getting in front of them, but making it part of a program. They all work independently, and they're very protective of their program because they're trying to entice students to them. But if it's done, if we can do this in a way, it's only making them a better journalist, a more thinking, thoughtful journalist. So maybe we need to have a wee wānanga about that, I reckon, because that would be the next step. But there's so many, you know, sort of plugging gaps and holes everywhere, but that's a good one.
I mean, education is so important, especially with the changing generation. I'm a 70s kid. Today the kids do, I'm no soil, I'm going to read Countdown and they can deliver my dinner. It's like,
Yeah.
and so that's what I'm saying, the influence of change,
Yeah.
transition in generations of education, it can't stay the same. It's got to change something in the curriculum where the kids' brains are absorbing
Yeah.
the change. I guess that's probably, because we as advisors, we're privileged to be on governance, to have our say, to listen and make a change for our tangata whaere and the secure unit. So it's about having something taken to the table.
Yep.
Change.
Beautiful.
Kia ora koutou. Mark, thank you so much. Again, I learned quite quickly when I joined CASA that if you have Mark on speed dial, or you have him in your email listing, then you are well connected in the sector. So know that number.
Yeah.
That number.
There was some benefit of working in media for 13 years, and is that I know lots of people in media, so I can, you know, it's just a different sort of influence, and I don't by all means know every single person, but it does help. So yeah. So thank you.
And he's got the lingo packed down. When he says sliding in DMs, you know, he's welcome.
Which is quite weird, given that I'm a crusty old boomer adjacent. So, but there you go.
Kia ora, stay
Kia ora.
there,
Oh.
Just before you go, Mark, I also just want to acknowledge the wonderful work that Mark does in the group boss.
Oh.
In this area. So just before you go, that's another big
Oh, thanks, CJ.
work, and you do it so beautifully.
Yeah.
Kia ora.
Can I just say that there's only one Mark?
That's the thing, you know, because I sort of, because I want all of this stuff to happen, but it's just one me. So maybe, who knows, maybe we've got a whole new beginning with a whole new kind of, maybe.
Kia ora. On behalf of Te Ata Hapara, thank you, Mark, for being a part of our day today.
Awesome, thank you.
Kia ora.
Thank you, my friend.
Okay, whānau, we have actually come to the end of our day, and we're just going to wrap up our kōrero and invite Tania and lots of Te Waihi to come. Before we do, we just have a burning tātai from Ireland.
Just that I can take the opportunity, is there anybody in this room who has either used awaka as particularly Māori, refused awaka te rā, or they're putting in form of used awaka te rā, so they can interview them relatively quickly soon. Thank you. And if that's you, or if you are able to pass this information on, just go to any of the other systems that are going to find me today to find me.
Kia ora whānau, kia ora.
And I think I've just got a couple of presentations for the data team that we would like to present your taonga and a reciprocity for you to present at another time. So if I could just make Judy, Brooke, Linda and Matt.
That was hilarious. Your oh, that's funny.
Figured out how we were trying to move this day into Learning and Development Day. We had our wonderful speakers, our international speakers, come and share knowledge, share evidence. And Te Ata Hāpara wanted to bring our own evidence to that party as well. So you may have noticed that our Mātauranga Māori has been privileged on the same platform as our international evidence and perhaps what we might think about traditional research rangahau, on which we have our own here as well. So hopefully you've figured that out. That's what we were trying to do. We're really excited and obviously try to pack a whole lot into your day because we're so keen for you to have access to all of this wonderful information. There's a lot of learnings for us. This is our first go at it to bring you this kind of level of information. We've learnt a lot. There's clearly some wānanga spaces that need to occur, and there's more kōrero from our international spaces and our local spaces. So I just want you to know that there's more to come, but hopefully you've taken something away with you today, and we look forward to seeing you in this space again. I'm going to hand over to Bree to just do a little summary.
Kia ora tātou. I just want to add on really quickly in terms of Tania's kōrero. Our beautiful Mason jury in 2004, he gave a kōrero around, he suggested it was not uncommon for Western science and Indigenous paradigms to find some common ground without compromising the foundations that they are situated on. So we acknowledge the two systems of learning and knowledge that we've received today and acknowledge them by way of the fact that they stand in their own mana, and we acknowledge that today. But he also said the importance around harnessing the energy of two systems of understanding in order to create new knowledge that can be used to advance understanding in two worlds. And so all the more privileged we are today to be able to be a part of this. And as Tan has just mentioned, the first for Te Ata Hāpara, and we absolutely look forward to coming back and bringing more opportunities of learning and development in this space. We do want to acknowledge really quickly all of our speakers who we've been privileged to hear today, by Lynn and Matua Wiri, Keith and Sarah Fortune, Sean from Te Rau Ora, Cheryl Waru, and beautiful to have her whānau with us, Dr. Takiri Rangi Smith, Jane Herkis, who we had the privilege of being part of and listening to her kōrero over a few days, and many of our speakers, and Mark Wilson, and just finally, again, just to acknowledge those who did take time and energy to pull together a presentation. We are holding that to account, Whānau. We're bringing you back in the next one, so hold those thoughts. But also, lastly, to our sponsors who have allowed us to make this day possible, our Iasp whānau, to also Liva, Te Rau Ora, and CASA, Clinical Advisory Services, Aotearoa, Ngā Kori Whirinaki, o Te Rau Au. Kia ora.
Before we just hand over to Matua to formally close us, I just wanted to acknowledge our directors of Te Ata Hāpara, Sarah Fortune, Sarah Hetrig and Tanya Cargo, and particularly all the other people in the room that are attached to Te Ata Hāpara, whether you got the memo, early or late. And to our representatives of Te Ata Hāpara standing with me today, I just wanted to acknowledge Matua Te Waire and Bree for an awesome day.
Return back to last week when we started, and everyone come together for the first one, and I want to pay respects to the first table, Kanoho Taihana, o Te Ara Hāpara. It was beautiful to meet them all that morning. It was beautiful to share so much knowledge, so much learning with you. On behalf of Bree and myself, we are so humbled to be in front of you, and we thank you for having us. Which talks about the collecting of how the birds come together in the morning in wānanga, and they come back at that night time and do wānanga, and they talk about all the experiences they've had, and they share it out with the world, and the whole people looked at people like yourself and took the word forward for the future.
Kia ora.
Tōreira kataurau, ko hoki tō kātou rangi. Ko te atua te pautoko mana o te ao hana ana nei ngā me kato, ko te atua te pauwairi o te tūrehere tangata, nāna nei ko te ora, ko te atua te pauwairi, nāna nei tātou mau ki te pua waitanga o te ui. I aku nui aku rahi, ko hiki te tapu i rui tēnei wānanga, ka hoki atu rā ki a rangi nui tūhone, ka whakahoki tau mana ki rui nā i o tama nui te rā, ka whakanoa mō tātou ki tītao o te hunga ora, ka hoki pēnei mai ai tātou. Kia tau, kia tātou kato, kia ata whai tō tātou ara ki raiti, e te ao hau te atua, e te whiwhina teitanga ki te wairo tapu, āwhia ki ake. Amen. Kia ora.
That was beautiful, but it's been really nice. Prepared, part of, yeah, just for when I do my Who's the
We have the birds coming in.
Yes. Are you after?
I'll go round. Thanks, Mark.
About you keen on
excuse me.
majority? Yeah. You're going to be waiting with the
I'm gifting you.
Oh, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah.